You prayed for answers, but God gave you silence. You reached out for clarity, but your hands touched only emptiness. Night after night, you've whispered the same questions into the darkness, wondering if heaven has forgotten your address. The stillness feels heavy, doesn't it? Like a weight pressing against your chest, making you question everything you thought you knew about divine communication. But what if I told you that the silence isn't abandonment? What if the quiet isn't God turning away, but God drawing you closer? Sometimes the most profound conversations happen without words, and maybe your spirit is learning a language that your mind hasn't recognized yet. There's something sacred about the space between asking and receiving. Something holy about the pause that feels like forever. You thought God forgot you, but maybe silence isn't absence. Maybe it's preparation. You've been carrying this ache for so long now. The kind that settles in your bones when prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling. When worship feels mechanical and scripture feels distant. When everyone around you speaks of hearing God's voice clearly, and you're left wondering what's wrong with your spiritual ears. The frustration builds slowly at first, then all at once. You start questioning your faith, your worth, your very connection to the divine. Maybe you've even wondered if you're being punished for something you can't remember, or if your heart has somehow become too broken to receive heavenly frequencies. Those 3 a.m. moments when sleep escapes you and doubt creeps in like fog. When you replay every conversation, every decision, every moment that might have created distance between you and the voice you so desperately need to hear. The enemy whispers that you're not spiritual enough, not pure enough, not faithful enough to deserve direct communication from the throne room of heaven. But those whispers are lies dressed as truth, designed to make you give up just before breakthrough arrives. Would you still trust divine timing if it meant waiting longer than you hoped? Would you still believe in God's goodness if the answer required more patience than you thought you possessed? Sometimes the silence isn't punishment. It's preparation for something your current capacity couldn't handle. Think about a surgeon who must work in complete concentration, free from distractions that could compromise the delicate procedure. Maybe that's what's happening in the operating room of your soul right now. Heaven is performing precision work that requires your complete stillness, your absolute trust, your unwavering faith, even when you can't see the surgeon's hands moving. The truth is, there are habits in our lives that create static in our spiritual communication, not because God is angry or distant, but because our souls have become cluttered with interference. Like trying to tune into a radio station while surrounded by electronic devices that create feedback and distortion. The signal is there, constant and clear, but we've unknowingly created barriers that muffle the transmission. Consider the busy executive who fills every moment with noise, every silence with stimulation. Her phone buzzes from sunrise to midnight. Her mind jumps from meeting to meeting, email to email, worry to worry. Even her prayers are rushed, squeezed between appointments like afterthoughts. She wonders why God feels distant, not realizing that she's created a lifestyle that makes hearing subtle spiritual whispers nearly impossible. Her good intentions have built walls around her heart that she doesn't even recognize. Or think about the believer who approaches prayer like a vending machine, inserting requests and expecting immediate delivery. When the divine doesn't respond according to human timelines, frustration builds. They begin to doubt not just God's timing, but God's presence altogether. What they don't understand is that their expectations have become barriers, their demands have created distance, their impatience has drowned out the gentle voice that speaks in whispers, not shouts. Maybe that's why it's been taking so long, because heaven's been building your heart first, expanding your capacity to receive what you've been asking for, strengthening your foundation so it can support the weight of the answered prayer, teaching you the difference between your voice and God's voice, between your desires and divine will, between human urgency and eternal perspective. The habits that silence God's voice aren't always obvious sins or deliberate rebellions. Sometimes they're simply the accumulated noise of a life lived without intentional space for divine encounter. The constant stimulation that has trained our minds to be uncomfortable with silence. The fear that masquerades as faith. The doubt that whispers louder than hope. The busyness that crowds out contemplation, the distractions that scatter our attention like leaves in a windstorm. Our minds crave quick answers. We live in an instant everything culture where waiting feels like punishment. But faith teaches us to sit with questions until peace becomes the answer. To trust that the delay is not denial, but divine orchestration working behind scenes we cannot see. To understand that God's silence doesn't mean God's absence, it often means God's protection, preservation, and preparation. Maybe it was never about finding the right circumstances, but becoming the person who could recognize God's voice in any situation. Maybe the journey through silence has been teaching your spirit a new language of trust, a deeper vocabulary of faith, a more profound grammar of grace. The habits that block divine communication are like layers of dust on a window. They don't change what's on the other side, they just make it harder to see clearly. But windows can be cleaned, static can be cleared, hearts can be tuned to heaven's frequency once again. The voice you've been longing to hear has never stopped speaking. It's been waiting patiently for you to create the conditions where it can be received. One day you'll look back and realize the silence wasn't empty. It was the sound of your roots growing deeper. The quiet wasn't abandonment. It was invitation to discover that God's presence doesn't depend on God's audible voice. That communion with the divine happens in ways that transcend human language and exceed earthly understanding. The first habit that silences God's voice is the noise we've mistaken for normalcy. We wake up to alarms, immediately reach for phones, fill every quiet moment with podcasts, music, or scrolling. Our minds have become addicted to stimulation, trained to feel uncomfortable in the very silence where divine whispers are most audible. We've created lives so loud that we can't hear our own thoughts, let alone the gentle voice of heaven. Think about the last time you sat in complete silence for 10 minutes without reaching for a device, without planning tomorrow, without replaying yesterday. It's harder than it sounds, isn't it? Because somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that busyness equals productivity, that noise equals aliveness, that constant motion equals purpose. But sacred communication requires sacred space. It demands the kind of stillness that feels foreign to our overstimulated souls. The second habit is approaching prayer like a cosmic customer service call. We present our requests with urgency, expecting immediate responses, and when heaven doesn't operate on our timeline, we assume the line went dead. This transactional mindset transforms relationship into ritual, conversation into complaint. We speak but don't listen. We petition but don't pause. We demand but don't receive, not because God isn't responding, but because we're too busy talking to hear the answer. Prayer was never meant to be a monologue. It's a dialogue that requires both speaking and listening, both presenting and receiving, both asking and accepting. When we treat the divine like a vending machine, inserting requests and expecting immediate delivery, we miss the profound intimacy available in simply being present with the presence that never leaves. The third habit that blocks divine communication is living in constant fear disguised as faith. Fear that we're not worthy enough to hear God's voice. Fear that what we're sensing isn't truly divine. Fear that we'll make the wrong decision if we trust what our spirit is receiving. This fear masquerades as humility, but it's actually pride inverted. It says our unworthiness is stronger than God's grace, our doubt more powerful than divine love. The fourth habit is carrying unforgiveness like armor, thinking it protects us when it actually isolates us. Bitterness creates static in our spiritual communication because it keeps our hearts tuned to the frequency of past pain rather than present grace. When we rehearse old wounds, replay ancient hurts, and nurture grievances like garden plants, we build walls around our hearts that even divine love struggles to penetrate. Forgiveness isn't about excusing others. It's about freeing ourselves to hear clearly again. The fifth habit that silences God's voice is perfectionism masquerading as devotion. We convince ourselves we need to be flawless before heaven will speak to us, that our prayers must be eloquent, our faith unwavering, our lives spotless. But this pursuit of spiritual perfection creates performance anxiety that drowns out the gentle voice that whispers, Come as you are. God doesn't speak to the perfect, but to the willing. Not to the polished, but to the present. The sixth, and perhaps most subtle habit, is spiritual comparison. We measure our divine encounters against others' testimonies, wondering why their prayers seem answered while ours echo in silence. We scroll through social media, seeing miracle stories and breakthrough moments, feeling spiritually inadequate by comparison. But divine communication is deeply personal, uniquely crafted for each soul's journey. When we compare our inner experience to others' highlight reels, we miss the sacred conversation happening in our own hearts. Breaking these habits isn't about perfection. It's about awareness. It starts with creating intentional silence, approaching prayer as conversation rather than transaction, releasing fear to make room for faith, choosing forgiveness over bitterness, embracing authenticity over performance, and celebrating your unique spiritual journey without comparison to others. The voice you've been longing to hear has been speaking all along. Sometimes it's in the stillness between thoughts, the peace that passes understanding, the gentle nudge toward kindness, the quiet conviction that redirects your steps. Divine communication isn't always dramatic, but it's always personal, always loving, always perfectly timed for the heart that's learned to listen. If this message found you at just the right moment, let it be confirmation that your spiritual journey is sacred, your questions are valid, and your heart is being prepared for deeper connection than you've yet imagined. Write Amen if you're ready to clear the static and hear heaven's whisper again.